The Battle for Moscow Chapter 3. To Moscow. Guderian returned somewhat crestfallen from the Rasenburg meeting, at which he had himself been persuaded that the Führer's decision to send armored formations to Leningrad and the Ukraine had been the correct one. This sudden change of face on the part of the panzer leader made Halder angry. To Guderian's surprise and hurt, von Bock recorded the details of the meeting in his diary on August 24, commenting that he had little time for a man who was without loyalty and was too easily swayed. So in the last week of August, Guderian, taking only 2 of his 3 panzer corps, in company with von Wax's 2 army, started on his long 400-mile march southward into the Ukraine, making slow progress because of the rain and the mud. Guderian, eager to improve his fortunes and extend his operative command, persuaded Paulus, the director of military operations, Oberquartiermeister I, who happened to be visiting him at the time, that part of von Wax's 2 army should be put under 2 panzer group, but this proposal found no favor with Halder, and Guderian took the refusal as an expression of the general animosity which the OKH felt towards him. Guderian also asked for the release of his 3rd Panzer Corps, but that request, too, was refused, since it was the only armored force retained by von Bock. Guderian's stream of signals asking for reinforcements and information continued to incense the OKH, but Guderian still had no precise knowledge of his destination, whether it was to be Kharkov or Kiev, even as he struggled on to the south point when, on September 3, Guderian's OKH liaison officer attended a conference presided over by von Brauchitsk at Army Group Center headquarters in Borisov. He represented Guderian's case too emphatically and was relieved of his duties. Even in victory, the German High Command did not function smoothly. Guderian's movement southwards had been observed by Soviet reconnaissance but was still regarded by the Kremlin as an effort to outflank Timoshenko's West Front and the Reserve Front, both of which lay, one behind the other, covering the western approaches to the capital. Stalin could hardly be censured for failing to appreciate the seemingly illogical thought process by which Hitler had sent his main armored strength off at right angles to the obvious and shortest axis to Moscow. Point 2. The Bryansk front was ordered at the end of August to launch an immediate offensive against Guderian's eastern flank. The commander of the Bryansk front was the cavalry leader Eremenko, who, in spite of his Ukrainian name, was of Russian peasant origin. He, too, had served in the Tsarist army as a non-commissioned officer, was stern, determined, experienced, and had a particularly cool head when in a tight corner. He was not highly intelligent. Yet, although self-willed, he had the habit, too rare in many Soviet generals at that time, of readily hearing out his subordinates, even though, for the most part, he took no notice of their views. Eremenko was not a sympathetic character and distrusted his subordinates and staff, this secrecy being taken to such lengths that, according to Sandloaf, he would not tell even his chief of staff of his movements in case the units on his visiting list should be warned by telephone. For Eremenko preferred to arrive unannounced. He lived in mortal dread of Stalin, this fear showing itself in a boastful overconfidence when in the dictator's presence. He staked his reputation when he assured Stalin that he could hold and destroy Guderian, and his fellow generals, with whom he was not too popular, did not allow him to forget it. Quarters tying up the details of the joint Army Group South and Army Group Center plan to capture Kiev and destroy the great Soviet groupings in the Dnieper-Desna Bend on the inter-army group boundary. Guderian was to continue down his north-south axis while Colonel General von Kleist's 1 Panzer Group, from Army Group South, marched directly north to meet him, the 2 Panzer Groups joining in the area of Romny and Lokhvitsa, about 140 miles to the east of Kiev and the Dnieper. These panzer thrusts were to cut off the whole of the southwest front of 6 Soviet armies in the Great Bend of the river, after which von Wax's 2 Army and Field Marshal von Reichenau's 6 Army were to destroy the encircled Soviet troops. Eremenko's counteroffensive was a failure, and in consequence Guderian and von Kleist made good progress towards meeting each other, in spite of the heavy rainstorms and the deep glutinous mud. On September 11 Gudini, the commander of Southwest Theater, and Kirpanos, the commander of Southwest Front, became aware of their danger and asked Shapashnikov and Stalin for permission to evacuate Kiev and withdraw eastwards. Budany, the former Tsarist cavalry non-commissioned officer whose military education did not extend far beyond his favorite catchphrase of "Saber 'em down," so aggravated Stalin by this request that he lost his appointment, whereas Khrushchev, the political member of the Theater Military Council, who during the war continually stressed how close he was to the dictator, was permitted to remain. Budany was sent to the repository of the unwanted, the reserve front on the Moscow highway. Since Moscow was no longer considered to be in immediate danger due to the change of direction of the thrusts of the German armor, Timoshenko was ordered, on September 12, to give up the command of West Front to Konyev, by then a colonel general, and hurry south to take over the Southwest Theater in the Ukraine. Meanwhile, Kirpanos, who had already been given orders to prepare to evacuate Kiev, presumably by Budany, had these orders countermanded and was told to stay on the Dnieper. The last act of the tragedy was yet to be played out. Kirpanos spoke on the telephone to Shapashnikov representing the danger he was in, and Shapashnikov, as usual, temporized. The military council of the Southwest Front was in despair, knowing that the time was running out, but feared Stalin too much jointly to sign the urgent and resolute appeal drawn up by Tupikov, the chief of staff. Major General Tupikov, once Soviet military attaché in Berlin and a very brave man, signed and dispatched it on his own responsibility, almost by return. Shapashnikov, so Bagramian says, called Tupikov a panic-monger. Timoshenko, Khrushchev, and the military council of the Southwest Theater knew that Tupikov was right but dared not intercede. Instead they sent Major General Bagramian, the theater chief of staff, with a verbal message suggesting to Kirpanos that he take the law into his own hands. Kirpanos was not to be drawn and referred the matter back to Shapashnikov. Not until September 17 would Stalin agree to a withdrawal of the Southwest Front, by which time it was more than 24 hours too late, since Guderian and von Kleist had already joined hands far to the east. 3. The Great Kiev Cauldron, which was about 130 miles in width and in depth, was destroyed during the next 10 days. About 450,000 prisoners were taken in the area of Kiev, and in all 665,000 prisoners fell to both army groups during the Operation. 4 The Soviet Southwest Front, which had resisted von Rundstedt with such obstinacy and skill throughout the summer, had been totally destroyed. Its commander Kirpanos, together with his chief of staff, Tupikov, and the political member of the military council, Burmistenko, who was also a secretary to the Ukrainian Communist Party Central Committee, being killed, it is said, by a shell. The circumstances of their deaths are obscure. For this great operational victory Hitler alone was responsible, and many of his senior staff, General Wagner, the quartermaster general among them, were to marvel at the military genius of the Führer, who had crowned with success an undertaking against which he had been warned by nearly all his advisers. 5 He was to reap yet further success in the Ukraine, for von Kleist's 1 Panzer Group and von Manstein's 11 Army were, on October 6, to surround and destroy 2 Soviet armies of the South Front. In the area of Osipenko near the Black Sea coast, taking 106,000 prisoners. Von Manstein then turned back into the Crimea, occupying the peninsula, except for the fortress of Sevastopol, at the beginning of November, with the capture of a further 100,000 Red Army men. In the north, in the area of Leningrad, however, Hitler was to have only minor success. In the first few weeks of the war the Finns had rapidly reoccupied the areas lost in the 1939–1940 Winter War, but they showed no inclination to advance on Leningrad or south of the river Svir. Hitler had come to the remarkable conclusion that he no longer wanted to occupy Leningrad but intended to raze it to the ground and obliterate it by shell, bomb, and fire. For this reason von Lieb had been ordered to give up any idea of a direct attack, in favor of an encirclement of the city to the east and an advance to the Svir. A panzer corps and an air corps, removed from von Bock, were to assist him in this operation. By mid-September the remaining enemy pockets had been cleared in Estonia and von Lieb reached the shore of Lake Ladoga near Schlüsselburg, so cutting all road and rail communications between Leningrad and the remainder of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, a slow but steady three-pronged advance was being made northeastwards towards the Svir and in the direction of Tikhvin and the Valdai Hills, through heavily wooded swamps which made movement difficult. When Hitler took the earlier decision to disperse his forces, including the air and panzer formations so essential to German success, over an area from the Baltic to the Black Sea 1,000 miles in extent, the reason he gave was that Leningrad, the Crimea, the Ukraine, the Donetsk Basin and Caucasia all had priority over Moscow and the destruction of the Red Army troops covering the capital. 6 Von Bock had reached Smolensk on July 17 and cleared the Great Pocket by August 6, but not until 23 August were the final orders issued for the next phase of the campaign, the orders which were to shift the main striking element of the German forces to the north and to the south. On September 5, only 13 days after taking this weighty decision, Hitler changed his mind and decided that, on the immediate conclusion of the Kiev battle, an advance on Moscow had the overriding priority. He made this decision at a time when the Kiev encirclement was hardly underway and when the redeployed German troops had not yet begun the fight for their distant objectives in the north and the south. On September 5 Kiev, the Crimea, and most of the east and central Ukraine were in Soviet hands and the Donetsk Basin and Caucasia were not even remotely threatened by German troops. In the north von Lieb's movement towards Tikhvin and the Valdai Hills had only just started, and the transfer of the firepower of the Air Corps and Panzer troops from von Lieb to von Bock was to result in Army Group North's advance coming to a halt in the face of stiffening Red Army resistance. The logic of Hitler's strategy in first turning away from Moscow is difficult to understand. Leningrad itself was of comparatively minor strategic importance and its encirclement and destruction were of no direct benefit to Germany's war aims, even though the Führer was to say that its capture might lead to the collapse of the whole Soviet regime. 7 Together with neighboring Kronstadt, it was of course a naval base, but this was without significance as the Baltic Red Banner fleet had been bottled up in the Gulf of Finland by mine barrages and a great anti-submarine steel net strung from Estonia to Finland. In any case the Baltic fleet was obsolete and outclassed, and lay stranded, largely uncrewed. In winter the Gulf of Finland froze over, imprisoning the Soviet war vessels where they were to lie a prey to the swift ski-mounted Finnish army patrols which came racing over the ice. There could be little advantage, either, in joining Army Group North with the Finns, who in any case were determined to wage war in their own way, for Helsinki was under heavy United States diplomatic pressure not to advance beyond their 1939 frontiers into the Soviet Union. The value of the Crimea could have been discounted since the Red Air Force long-range bombing strength was insignificant and its slow, heavy, and cumbersome planes, operating without escort and flying in close formation, could be shot down by lone German fighters at will. The Donetsk Basin and the Caucasus would of course have been of great economic value but were too far afield to have been of use to Germany that winter. The only gain in turning away from Moscow was the destruction of Kirponos's southwest front, but this was done at an enormous cost in wear and tear in tanks, vehicles, men, and above all in horses, which were dying through overexertion at the rate of thousands a day. This cost could not be made good until the end of 1942. Equivalent, perhaps better, results might have been obtained by attacking and destroying Timoshenko's West Theater in front of Moscow. As it was, Hitler was opposed to very deep operational panzer thrusts but preferred closer objectives, advancing uniformly by bounds across the map of Russia with a north-south line without salients or exposed flanks, and he over-exaggerated the importance of the Red Army concentrations at Veliky Luki and Kiev near the Army Group boundaries, concentrations of troops which in any event were hardly mobile. So, as Halder said, he altered his strategy merely to counter the tactics of the enemy. Whatever Hitler's reasons, the effect was that the impatient von Bock's Army Group Center, the only group which had up to then achieved any outstanding success, lay from July to October motionless and virtually passive only 200 miles from the capital. In West and Central European Russia the winter snows do not melt until late March or April, the thaw giving rise to flooding and very bad going conditions. Spring comes suddenly and is very short, and the hot summer starts in late May. Rain falls regularly throughout the summer months, turning roads and tracks into quagmires, but the rainstorms are soon over and the tracks quickly dry out in the sweltering heat. The summer is already ended by the beginning of September, the autumn is very short and the weather finally breaks up in October, with alternating heavy rain, sleet, hard frosts, occasional snow and frequent thaws. This is the period of the Rasputin, meaning the breaking up of the roads. The countryside is often covered with great sheets of water over a foot deep as far as the eye can see. Hard roads begin to disintegrate and bridges are swept away or isolated in the floods, the tracks become canals of knee-deep, even waist-deep, slush and mud. The clouds are low and the skies leaden grey, and the constant rain has a most depressing effect on all but those of the most stolid temperament. Except on the railways all movement ceases and only the high-slung Russian pannier carts, pulled by teams of small wiry native ponies, are capable of covering the ground. The spells of hard frost and the approach of the colder weather harden the ground once more and traffic starts up again until the arrival of the heavy snows in December. Then movement off the main snow-cleared routes is very difficult except to tracked vehicles, sledges, and ski troops. Water and mud, however, are far more effective obstacles to movement than snow. During the hard winter the day temperature can drop to -30 degrees centigrade. In the hours of darkness it may be even colder. Only the warmly clad and well-fed can stay out at night in the open without ill effects, and then only provided that the blood circulation can be maintained. Throughout the centuries the Russian peasant has become housebound during the severest weather, his dwelling usually consisting of nothing more than a 1 or 2 roomed izba, a thatched wooden and plaster shack, built around a huge brick and mud stove on which the whole family slept. There they wintered it out, together with their livestock. German troops were to rely on these verminous little hovels to keep them alive in the coming months. Hitler thought the war was almost over and he wanted to take Moscow as part of a major advance to reach the Archangel-Middle Volga-Astrakhan line before the arrival of winter. Army Group South was to move into the Caucasus. The resumption of the offensive was to become for Army Group Center a race against time, not merely to find winter quarters, but to arrive at such far-flung objectives as Yaroslavl, Gorky, and Ryazan, some of which were 200 miles to the east of Moscow. 8 No winter equipment or winter clothing had as yet been provided for the troops. But the most serious problem by far, although this does not appear to have been appreciated at the time by the German High Command or by the senior field commanders, was going to be that of operational movement and logistics, that is to say, maintenance, supply and transport, during the late autumn rains and thaws. This factor was to be of the most crucial importance. The first task was to concentrate in the general area of Smolensk the German troops earmarked for the offensive. Hoth's panzer troops moved back from von Lieb to von Bock, and Hoepner's 4 Panzer Group, formerly with Army Group North, followed. In all, von Lieb lost 5 panzer and 2 motorized divisions. His protests that their loss would not only halt his own advance but would leave him vulnerable to a Soviet counter-offensive were brushed aside with the retort that von Bock's eastward movement would weaken Soviet counter-pressures elsewhere. 8th Air Corps, commanded by von Richthofen, that had earlier been detached from Kesselring to the area of Leningrad, returned to its parent 2 Air Fleet in the center. Guderian and von Wakes, 300 miles to the south, were much too far away to reach the vital Smolensk area in time for the new offensive, and so it was decided that they should attack in a northeasterly direction towards Moscow from the northern borders of the Ukraine. In addition to the return of 2 Army and 2 Panzer Group from the Ukraine to Russia, they had never been part of Army Group South. Von Rundstedt was obliged to transfer to von Bock 9 divisions, of which 2 were panzer and 2 motorized, and he was to regret the loss of these forces when he himself came to be thrown out of the doorway to the Caucasus later in the year. Since the only railway lines which had been retracked to the Central European gauge were those which ran from west to east, all the infantry divisions transferred from the Ukraine to Smolensk went by the march route on their feet. By thinning out army groups north and south, the strength of von Bock's army group center had been raised to 70 divisions, of which 14 were panzer and 8 were motorized infantry. 9 Air support was to be provided by Kesselring with 2 Air Corps comprising about 1,000 aircraft of the 2,400 then available in the east. The Soviet strength covering the approach to Moscow was estimated by German intelligence at the end of September to be as high as 80 infantry divisions, 11 tank brigades and 9 cavalry divisions, in the event a reasonably accurate assessment, and the total Red Air Force on the whole of the Russo-German front was put at only 1,100 aircraft. The Army Group center frontages extended over 400 miles and von Bock held less than 2 divisions as Army Group Reserve. The OKH held no reserves at all. The new offensive, which was later known by the name of Typhoon, was based on the outline of Hitler's Directive 35 of 6 September, the main planning being done between the OKH and von Bock's headquarters, all orders being subjected to the Führer's scrutiny and veto. The deployment of the 6 armies of the enemy West Front and 2 of the 3 of the Bryansk Front to the immediate south, all of which were in contact, was known to German intelligence, but, as was normally the case, there was no information at all on Red Army formations to the rear. The hurriedly constructed lines of defenses right back to the capital, however, were easily identifiable from the air. Von Bock's immediate task, before moving eastwards on his way to the Archangel-Middle Volga line, was to destroy Konyev's West Front, and this was to be done by the practiced and well-rehearsed double panzer envelopment. 10 The left pincer, made up of Strauss's 9 Army and Hoth's 3 Panzer Group, was to circle out from the area of Smolensk and, breaking through the enemy defenses, advance rapidly in a great arc which was to close on the railway junction and city of Vyazma, just over 100 miles in the Red Army rear. The right pincer, of von Kluge's 4 Army and Hoepner's 4 Panzer Group, was to move from the area south of Smolensk and, first circling southwards, come in upon Vyazma from the south. As usual, the penetration was to be the responsibility of the infantry armies and the task of rapid envelopment that of the panzer groups. Within limits, the plan was a repetition of the June encirclement at Minsk. At the same time, it was intended that, in the south, Guderian and von Wakes should envelop and destroy Eremenko's Bryansk front. The operation for the destruction of the West and the Bryansk fronts was well conceived and planned. But, as Hitler saw the situation, it was only the preliminary to the main aim, the advance to the final occupation line. The Führer's views were becoming increasingly bizarre, and his earlier statement that the city of Moscow had no significance began to take on a more vivid meaning. For, apparently believing that when the West and Bryansk fronts had been destroyed there would be no worthwhile enemy forces left in Old Russia, he had decided that he would not occupy Moscow at all but would merely ring it with his troops and, in a fate it was to share with Leningrad, destroy it by bombing and artillery fire. None of the civilian population was to be let out, and any enemy offers to surrender the city were to be rejected. In this way Hitler showed how little Moscow mattered to him as a historical and cultural center, and the value he placed on the lives of its inhabitants. Yet it is almost beyond credibility that Hitler, as statesman or as soldier, should have wantonly destroyed Moscow as a seat of government and an industrial complex, and disregarded its value as a communication and rail center. Common sense should have told him that in it were the only available winter quarters for a large proportion of his troops. Since the Führer was determined to advance beyond Moscow, he intended that Guderian's 2 Panzer Group, which after October 6 was to be redesignated as 2 Panzer Army, should outflank Moscow from the south in the direction of Mtsinsk and Tufa, while von Weichsel's 2 Army should, after the destruction of the Bryansk front, cross the Panzer Group axis and move due east from Orel towards the Don and the great industrial center of Voronezh, 200 miles to the south of Moscow. Von Kluge's 4 Army and Hoepner's 4 Panzer Group were to bypass Moscow immediately to the north and south of the city, while Strauss's 9 Army and Hoth's 3 Panzer Group were to turn northeast from Vyazma towards Kalinin and the Valdai Hills, about 150 miles north of the capital, as part of the advance towards Yaroslavl. At the beginning of October von Bock recorded his disagreement with this wide dispersal of his forces. 12. The many German assessments of the fighting value of the Soviet fleet and the Red Air Force at this time are in general accord. The Red Fleet was an almost negligible factor since it was poorly trained and inadequately equipped, and its higher command tended to lack enterprise. The Red Air Force, although large in numbers, was equipped with aircraft mainly obsolete and of very crude design. The standard fighters were the I-15 or I-153 biplane with a maximum speed of only 230 miles per hour, and the I-16 low-winged single-radial-engined monoplane known as the Rada, which, although very maneuverable, had a maximum airspeed of only 285 miles per hour. Neither of these fighters was a match for the German Me-109, and they were actually outpaced by the Luftwaffe's medium bombers. The TB-1 and TB-2 heavy bombers had top speeds of about 130 miles per hour, while the fast medium bombers, the SB-1 and SB-2, could not fly faster than 260 miles per hour. Although 1,700 modern fighters had been brought into use by June 1941, mainly Yak-1, Lag-3, and MiG-3, all of these were inferior to the Me-109, only 18 air regiments had been re-equipped with them, and most of these were destroyed in the summer fighting. The new Stormovik IL-2 single-engined ground attack fighter with an armored rear was already in service in limited numbers, and although this plane was admirable as a tactical support aircraft, in some respects being superior to the German equivalent, the Stuka Ju-87, with the top speed of 280 miles per hour, it hardly ranked as a fighter. The PE-2 twin-engined fighter bomber, a copy of the German Me-110, with a speed of 340 miles per hour, was occasionally to be seen. In the summer and autumn of 1941 these more modern aircraft were only rarely met, and the Red Air Force continued to rely on the 115, the Rada, and the ubiquitous two-seater biplane first designed in 1927 and known as the Po-2 or U-2. There were large numbers of these about, and they were to fly throughout the whole war as reconnaissance and intercommunication aircraft and as light bombers. They had an airspeed of only 100 miles per hour. At the beginning of the war the auxiliary equipment in Soviet aircraft was of very inferior design. Little radio was used, there was no intercommunication equipment inside the aircraft, and no radar or modern direction and locating aids were in service, pilots flying at treetop height by map and their own keen eyesight. The repair and maintenance system was primitive. Red Air Force pilots in these early days of the war were no match in leadership or flying skills for the well-trained, superbly equipped and battle-experienced Luftwaffe. Soviet fighter pilots in particular lacked spirit and dash and would often avoid engagements, turning away even from unescorted Ju-52 transports, all of which carried defensive armament, when these were flying in close formation. Red Air Force bomber pilots on the other hand showed determination and courage and, because they were unescorted or unsupported by Soviet fighters, suffered heavily in consequence. The U-2 pilots were renowned for great ingenuity and skill. All aviators and ground crews had great endurance and hardiness, being particularly clever at improvisation, and they flew in all weather, however low the cloud and however restricted the visibility. The vastness of the theater of war and hinterland and the fact that the Red Air Force decentralized its resources to ground formations as low as that of Army, the Air Forces being actually under the command of the Army General rather than in support, saved the Red Air Force from being completely destroyed by the German air arm. For this latter reason, too, the Luftwaffe's mastery was never total and the Red Air Force always had something in the air. On the other hand, except for the very early German successes in Belorussia in June and July, because frontages had become so vast and because both German and Soviet air resources were so limited, air intervention by itself was never decisive to the outcome of the land battle in the Russian theater. Not until the Red Army re-entered Central Europe in 1944, when frontages were once more restricted and the Luftwaffe very weak, did the Red Air Force play a major part in the land fighting. Although there is general agreement on the fighting value of the Soviet sailor and airman at this time, contemporary German opinions on the Red Army soldier vary widely. It is known that tens, even hundreds, of thousands gave themselves up with hardly a fight and that many took to their heels. Before the end of 1941, Army Group Center alone was to take over 1,900,000 prisoners. 13 Yet in some sectors Red Army troops would fight with the greatest obstinacy, at times their resistance being fanatical, and there was no clear pattern for the very wide dissimilarity. The Red Army was of course multinational and polyglot and so its characteristics and efficiency were not uniform. Some soldiers, still smarting from the more recent communist repressions, listened too readily to the German loudspeakers, others, no less gullible, were incited by their commissars to race hatred and barbarism. Yet these were not the only explanations. Some formations or units would suddenly surrender en masse after resisting obstinately for a day, others, after starting badly and losing heavily in line crossers, would quickly regain their resolution and fight to the very end. Terrain seemed to affect the Red Army behavior. In mountain waste or in broken and close country, forest, or marsh, on conditions favoring the defense and where he was not threatened by German armor, the Soviet soldier generally fought better than in the open. The resistance varied, too, by theaters. Russian formations in the far north were inferior to the Finns, but they were equal to German troops. Soviet resistance to Army Group North near Leningrad and in the wooded swamps to the north of Lake Ilmen was uniformly bitter. But in the Ukraine and in the area of Smolensk, the fighting value of the Red Army might be high or negligible. For when 52 German Infantry Division was ordered, on August 16, to take a limited objective near the Belarusian railway town of Rogachev, just 100 miles to the southwest of Smolensk, many of the defenders fled in terror and, for the lightest of casualties, the German division took, within 24 hours, 15,000 prisoners, 1,000 horses, 40 heavy guns and much other equipment. The influence of the Commissar was not particularly strong at this period in spite of the fact that his power had been restored to that of parity with the military commander, so that no orders could be issued without his counter-signature. The authority of the Commissar was to become stronger, however, as the months of war went by, and Red Army prisoners in German hands were to recount how their own troops had been shot down in battle by commissars for reluctance to move when under fire. Sometimes an inexperienced, stupid, or headstrong commissar was a hindrance and an obstruction, yet the threat of the Commissar's pistol and his incessant propaganda did galvanize the lethargic and passive soldiery into activity and often achieved a surprising degree of efficiency. And Stalin's criminal law, which held hostage the relatives of soldiers taken prisoner, presumably prevented some troops from deserting. Yet the influence of the Commissar cannot be judged as entirely political or necessarily obstructive, for often he worked hand in glove with the military commander and sometimes he was an experienced soldier with many years of service behind him. Comparatively few commissars appear to have been taken prisoner, some took their own lives, some fled, some, throwing away papers and tunic, denied their true identity and passed themselves off as soldiers, running the gauntlet of the SS Einsatzkommandos who attended at the prisoner of war cages and who have feared the Red Army prisoners' rewards for the denunciation of Jews and commissars among their number. For in those early days a commissar prisoner often met his death with a pistol bullet in the back of his neck. Moscow had suffered its first air attack on July 22 and further attacks followed on subsequent nights. A small percentage of the population was evacuated and, as already recounted, part of the Soviet High Command was temporarily transferred to the Moscow underground railway stations. The German bombing attacks, made by about 200 aircraft, appear to have been ordered on political and emotional grounds rather than for reasons of war. The Wehrmacht was only 200 miles away and the Kremlin lived in daily expectation and fear of the final thrust on the capital. Frantic efforts had been made to build two great earthwork systems west of Moscow using a large civilian labor force, most of whom were women, the defenses being based on linear anti-tank ditches 15 to 20 feet deep, ditches which were, in the event, of only minor value. For as soon as enemy infantry and engineers reached the obstacle at 1 or 2 points, the ditch was easily bridged or filled in, enabling hundreds of tanks to penetrate at each crossing place. So the enormous effort required to dig the hundreds of miles of tank traps was largely wasted. The great belts of anti-tank ditches were thickened up by minefields, barricades and strong points. The forward of these defensive systems, known as the Vyazma Line, running from an area about 30 miles east of Ostashkov near the Valdai Hills in the north, to the region west of Vyazma and then to beyond Kirov in the south, being in all about 200 miles in length. The rearward Mazaysk Line was about 80 miles to the west of Moscow and ran from Volokholamsk to Litvin and was about 160 miles in extent. A further 4 semicircular defense lines ringed Moscow from the west. The defense of the approaches to Moscow had been entrusted to West Theater, commanded by Timoshenko until September 12, when he had been sent off to the Ukraine. The West Theater stretched from its boundary with Lieutenant General Kurakin's northwest front at Ostashkov in the north, to Vorozhba at the junction with the southwest front in the south, and was made up of 3 separate fronts. Of these the principal was West Front, commanded by Konyev, deployed 60 miles to the west of Vyazma and stretching from the Ostashkov Lakes to the town of Elna, about 40 miles southeast of Smolensk. Konyev's West Front consisted of 6 Soviet armies all deployed in line from north to south, and all in contact with the enemy. The Reserve Front, temporarily once again under the command of Budany who had just arrived from the Ukraine, consisted of a further 6 armies in line from north to south and echeloned in depth behind Konyev's West Front. The Reserve Front was roughly on the Vyazma Line, from the source of the Volga near Ostashkov in the north to Elna in the south. Budany's troops were not in contact with the enemy except on the extreme left, where Lieutenant General Rokutin's 24 and Major General Sobenikov's 43 armies formed the link between the West and the Bryansk fronts. To the south of Sobenikov's 43 Army of the Reserve Front, beyond the Roslavl-Kirov railway line, ran Eremenko's Bryansk Front, consisting of Major General Petrov's 50 Army, Major General Kreiser's 3 Army and Major General Gorodniansky's 13 Army, with the Ermakov group of cavalry, tanks, and infantry covering the southern flank and maintaining contact with the most northerly formation of the Southwest Front. West Theater numbered 83 infantry divisions, each of an establishment of about 10,000 men, 9 cavalry divisions which number bared no more than about 3,000 men each, and 13 tank brigades in all, 1,200,000 men, 770 tanks, and 360 aircraft, this amounting, according to the Soviet account, to 40% of the field holdings of infantry formations and about 35% of the available tanks and aircraft. 15 The tank brigades, of 50 or 60 tanks each, had been allocated to the infantry armies. When, in the second week in September, Timoshenko had given up the command of West Theater, Stalin had brought the three fronts directly under his own control. Stalin was unaware, until the end of September, that a gigantic German thrust was about to be launched on his center in the direction of Moscow. He was in any event being oppressed by bad news from all other fronts, and he could scarcely credit that the Wehrmacht was capable of undertaking yet another, almost simultaneous, major offensive. Zhukov was in Leningrad, having been made responsible for the defense of that city against the furious German attacks which took von Lieb to the shores of Lake Ladoga. The destruction of Kirponos's southwest front in the Great Kiev Cauldron was not completed until September 26, and Timoshenko had recoiled eastwards, closely pressed by the German pursuit, forming as he did so another southwest front out of the Southwest Theater headquarters and such remnants of the field forces as could be collected. Further to the south events had not stood still. Since September 24, General von Manstein's 11th Army had been making determined attacks down the Periko Isthmus to get into the Crimea, and Stalin had no great faith in the ability of the local military commander, F.I. Kuznetsov, to hold him, for Kuznetsov had already failed twice in his earlier appointments. Von Rundstedt had turned von Kleist's I Panzer Group, after October 6 redesignated as I Panzer Army, southwards across the river Samara in what was obviously to be an attempt to envelop Lieutenant General Ryabishev's south front. There were indeed diversions enough to distract the attention of Stalin and Shapashnikov away from the area of Smolensk. The German High Command achieved operational and tactical surprise for the simple reason that it was impossible for the Soviet leadership and the General Staff, even if they had been endowed with great clarity of vision and excellent intelligence, which they were not, to understand the thought processes of the Führer's brain or to have read a strategic pattern into the German operations. Of the inconsistencies of Hitler's military Flitterglersamkeit and the vagaries of his Flederwisch logic, Stalin's Stavka had no understanding, and for this they could hardly be blamed. For when Halder, the Chief of General Staff, heard some of the detail of the Führer's plan, including the outward thrust to the Valdai Hills, he could only shrug and note in his diary that the operational intention was to him entirely unclear. As the Moscow offensive was about to start, Hitler issued an order of the day in which he promised his troops that in this last decisive to Moscow battle of the year the enemy would be destroyed together with the instigator of the whole war, England. For, as soon as the enemy was destroyed, England would lose its last ally on the continent. He went on to liken the Soviet Union to a danger to Europe no less frightful than that of the Huns and Mongols. The next day, on October 3, the Führer made the announcement that not before then was he permitted to tell the German people that the foe was already broken and would never rise again.